And welcome. I'm Hillel Fratkin. I'm the director of here at the Hudson Institute of the Center on Islam, Democracy, and the Future of the Muslim World, as well as editor of a journal on political Islam called Current Trends in Islamist Ideology. It's my privilege to introduce our speakers and chair this meeting. And to welcome all of you, both here at Hudson and also our C-SPAN audience. For approximately 4 months, the Arab world has been the scene of dramatic events, especially dramatic in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, the Gulf, and of course, Libya. There have been many differences among these events, but all share in common, it seems to me, two things: dissatisfaction with the current state of affairs, the status quo, a status quo which in many cases has been around for 40 or even 50 years, and the desire for some new beginning. And this desire for a new beginning has, I think, led to the popular name given to all of these events, the Arab Spring. This movement, this general movement both of dissatisfaction and hope, has now come to Syria, a country which, if I might say so, is especially distinguished by the unchanged character of its situation and regime. It has lived for an exceptionally long time under the same regime and the same family. So in that sense, it is, and others, an important touchstone of this movement. It raises the question, will the Arab Spring move forward as to follow the metaphor to summer, or will it revert to winter, to the past, or a continuation of the status quo? Now, this is important generally for people in looking at the whole phenomenon of the Arab Spring, but also, of course, and most particularly, it's important to the people of Syria, as well, I might add, to its neighbor and its people, Lebanon. It is also important to the United States. The current regime has been, to put it mildly, no friend of ours, quite the contrary. The events in Syria, and especially the most recent events, are terribly important, and we are very fortunate to have today 3 people who can guide us through these events, describe them, analyze them, and perhaps even predict the way in which they may be going forward. Our first speaker is Amara Abdul Ameed, a native of Syria, who has, however, been living in this country for quite a while, owing to his activities in that country, and activities on behalf of change and liberal democracy in particular. Amara, you can speak from there or at the podium.
I think that probably we can stick to the podium. It's thank you very much for having us here. Thank you, Lee and Hilla, for organizing this. This is really an important time for us to be communicating a clear message about what's really happening inside Syria, how we got started with this situation, and what sort of transitional scenarios we are looking at right now. Basically, I think I will sort of try to speak about 3 points briefly, so I can allow more time to my colleagues and also for your questions. The first point I would like to address is how we got started. The second point is that the transitional period we're looking at right now, and what sort of role we are hoping, at least as dissident and activist and opposition members, that we will see in what role the army will play. And the third point is, are we organizing? What's the alternative? Is there really an alternative to this regime? And who are the key people who will play a role in that? The whole thing got started actually In fact, back when Bashar al-Assad himself came to power in 2000, if you want to look that far into it. Because from the very beginning, a lot of people saw an opportunity now, finally, to begin to challenge the system. The opposition were divided at the time between people who were completely against the family transition, and they were in the minority. But most people in the opposition accepted the transition, but made it conditional on sort of Assad implementing certain reforms. And they used Bashar's own speech in the, when he accepted the presidency and he accepted the nomination by the Ba'ath Party for that position, that he will, implement some reforms and that he will indeed sort of change course for the country. Now, the inability of Bashar al-Assad to implement anything was really the problem and created the crisis of trust in his leadership. After sort of the promises were made, there was a period called Damascus Spring that lasted for a few months, and it witnessed a lot of activities on the grassroots level by the dissidents, by the opposition. They created literary salons. They tried to reach out to the grassroots. They tried to sort of form new parties, new movements. They immediately called for social reconciliation, realizing that the sectarian divide is real and that this issue needs to be addressed. They tried to tackle the Kurdish problem and invite a lot of Kurdish politicians to take part in the process so that a national unity of sort is established on the grassroots. I think once Assad realized that this is a very serious sort of development, immediately the crackdown started. Many of the key figures in this movement were put in jail. The usual accusation of being part of a foreign conspiracy, embassies are interfering, whatever, foreign funding, and all of the issues that are the usual accusations that always used in these kind of situations to justify repression. So the fact that we are now being accused of being foreign conspirators is really nothing new. We've been living under this accusation since we were born, I guess, in Syria. If you're not for the regime, you're a conspirator. It's as simple as that.
Even in the womb.
Even in the womb, I think. Yes, yes. It's something we've really imbibed in our culture. That movement, Damascus Spring, was short-lived, but afterwards, basically, the sort of the Syrian dissident community inside Syria realized that we have to be somewhat more confrontational and more organized, and there were different sort of paths on how we can do this. There were a group of people like me and others who believed in activism rather than in the traditional political sort of activities, which is that we wanted to create networks of activists on the ground, apolitical and not apolitical really, but not affiliated with any of the usual political factions. And our message was that by creating sort of a greater awareness among the young people of the need to bridge the sectarian divide, the role that this will play in facilitating transition, the need to actually just do something on the ground rather than talk and theorize about, socialism and communism and imperialism and all this, was really the driving force behind this kind of activities. And we've managed to actually create networks that, metastasize in due course of time into the kind of situation we see today. Not wanting to dwell too much on this past, but this is how sort of the germs were sort of spread. And after 2005, with the assassination of Prime Minister Rafiq al-Hariri and the fact that all eyes were on Syria at the time, and the Syrian forces were withdrawn from Lebanon, Bashar's position in the country became somewhat weakened, and the travel from the battle lines from that moment really were sort of shifted and became purely inside Syria. Syria can still play a regional role and meddle in affairs and whatever, but now they needed to use proxies more and more. And the challenge now, the international community was focused really on development inside Syria. Bashar had to make again some promises of reform and change inside the country that he, of course, did not deliver on. But everybody realized now Bashar really needed to maintain the Syrian base, having lost the periphery, having lost the empire, you can say. And ever since that time, the situation, in fact, became difficult for activists because Bashar needed to make damn certain that he has complete control now inside Syria. So whatever divisions there were in the regime, whatever chinks there were in the regime, His main task was to actually fix them and to make sure that he has full control. From the point of view of the opposition, also this was an opportunity for us to prevent that from happening, to get our acts together, and to see if we can field a greater challenge inside Syria. Obviously, we didn't do a good job, as you can see. At the end of the period in 2007, 2008, Bashar emerged once again as a person in charge of the country. And we sort of, despite attempts at unity and the fact that we came up with the Damascus Declaration, a major document that sort of unified and united the Syrian opposition for a while inside and outside the country, and was heavily endorsed by the international community, we still couldn't really move beyond that and the organizational capacity, and we still had limited ability to sort of rally the street to our cause. So in a sense, you can say that we lost another battle, but we also won something. We won an experience, and a lot of people after that realized that we really need to focus more on activities on the ground. This high-end politics, and involvement in sort of political alliances and forming political parties and coalition is really nonsensical if you don't have support on the ground. So after that period, 2007-8, basically people realized that we really need to work on the ground, and this is where the action should be. So now, quietly, a lot of activists began sort of working on the ground, trying to sort of communicate the message of change, trying to create support networks in different communities for the change, trying to articulate the message why we need and why the local communities need to be more politically active, how this is relevant to them. So, and we tried to do this by creating sort of YouTube videos on the need for change, on the realities in Syria. We created the foundation that I headed at the time, Tarwa. We created, we made a TV program called First Step, in which we articulated sort of a message on the need for democratic change and on the impact of authoritarianism on our way of life. Why we have, for instance, child labor, why we have poverty, why the problem has not been resolved or addressed effectively in many, many years, under Bashar and even before Bashar. And all of that was really linked through the discussion, common sense discussion, basically, to the fact that we have a system that's not accountable in any sense to the people. We have people in the regime like the Assad himself and his family and their comrades in arms in the Ba'ath Party and the military, whatever, playing sort of thinking themselves above the law, and as such not really we cannot, if we cannot hold them accountable, then there is no way we can do any kind of implement any kind of reforms. We try to articulate this message as clearly as possible and in a variety of ways, and also we relied on feedback from people on the ground to articulate this message. And for a 2-year period between 2009 to 2011, basically, we've had this message on YouTube. We've had it also on an opposition channel called Barada, that and we replayed it over and over and over again. We really had very limited resources, so we've managed to produce only very few programs, but we kept playing them. The message was very clear, so we were hoping that by simply repeating it, it will seep through. Now we found out that actually we're pretty successful at that, because many of the messages we hear right now on the ground and coming from the protesters seem to have reflected the kind of dialogue and language that is used in this kind of programs. But we cannot, of course, the elephant in the room is the Bouazizi and Sidi Bouzid incident in Tunisia. Had it not been for that young man and that incident that took place and that spark that started in Tunisia, we would not be talking about the Syrian revolution today. So, of course, a lot of people finally began to talk to us, reach out to us, send us emails, communicate with us via social network sites like Facebook and Twitter and other channels, was really when the Tunisian revolution happened. Even as it unfolded, and even before Ben Ali was toppled, there were people from inside Syria, people we did not know. And we later on discovered that actually they were in their late teens and early 20s, talking to us and saying, we can do that. You've been saying this could happen. We never really believed it, but now we can see it happening somewhere else. And look, we can do this here. Why not? And so we began talking about preparations and time. For a long time, I really believed that we should push it until August if we wanted to do something, because I felt that reporting on developments is going to be extremely important in a country like Syria, where there is limited room for maneuverability by foreign media. And of course, the state-run press is going to be completely negative and is not going to play any role in covering the event. So I felt that we needed more time to make sure that we are covering the entire country and that we have what it takes to actually be able to cover the development and the event on the ground to the international community in a timely manner. But I was outvoted after a period of discussion, basically, and a lot of people inside Syria felt that if we don't start now and soon, because of what's happening in Libya, because of the violence in Libya, that people will feel afraid of actually joining any kind of a protest movement. So, and also we've already seen some sparks and some attempts, like in February 17th, there was a spontaneous demonstration in downtown Damascus. 1,500 people basically raising a slogan that caught the attention of everybody. The Syrian people will not be humiliated. When a traffic violation led to a confrontation between a policeman and sort of local community, and immediately people poured into the street, and this was something that was a slogan that was raised by the protesters at the time. So I think these kind of spontaneous events, and there were several others that happened afterwards, really indicated what kind of language and what kind of slogans that need to be raised, and the people were finding their voice.
So the revolution wouldn't wait for it.
Exactly. So basically, we had to go with the flow of events inside the country, and this is really where the difference between the official line accusing us on the outside of fomenting this and organizing it, and actually where we, in a sense, were being led by people on the ground, new generation of activists, very young, youthful, enthused, and they took our advice. They wanted some ideas on how things can be done, and they looked to us to also be their mouthpieces, basically outside the country. But the reality is, they are the leaders, and
maybe you would also now say something about where you think the situation is at now.
Exactly. I think this is a good point to transition to, because right now we're talking about a self-organizing movement, collective leadership, a new generation, fresh blood being infused into the situation, which is why if with all this kind of cracking down that's happening by the regime, to the point of deploying tanks, to the point of using heavy artillery in the city of Daraa, basically, and arbitrary arrest, firing at unarmed protesters, lying to the people and saying they are Salafist infiltrators, and all that sort of tired, really, accusations that we've heard repeated and reiterated in Libya and Egypt and elsewhere in Yemen, and so that kind of development has sort of led this movement to become more adamant, led the protesters to immediately raise their level of demands to reforms in the first few days, or freedom, which is, and the Syrian people will not be humiliated, to the people who want to topple the regime, down with the Assad, or Assad, you dog, send your troops to the Golan. Sometimes, of course, this is not meant as a sign of war necessarily, as many people think. They want to, go ahead and open the front with Israel, but it's more like a taunt. If you're killing us, and you're supposed to have an occupation, it just doesn't make any sense. So this is the kind of situation we're in right now. Protest movement that's still alive and well, despite the heavy crackdown by the regime. I'm hoping that tomorrow will prove that point by when people take to the street, hopefully in mass numbers again, to show that despite the violence, they are still willing to risk their lives in order to fight for freedom and for dignity. The army, for us, has an important role to play. One of the slogans that was raised by the protesters, a similar slogan to the one that was raised in Egypt as well, is that the people in the army are one, or one hand. Now, in a country like Syria, with the sectarian divide that we have, and the fact that the minority community, the Alawite community, is playing a key role in the army and is used by the Assad basically as their bastion of support, that slogan is not naive. That slogan, as people think, that slogan actually is meant as a reassurance to the Alawite community that if you're looking for guarantees, on what's going to happen if the Assad are out of power, we are telling you, you're going to have a lot of say through the army. No one is challenging the legitimacy of the army. No one is asking for the Alawites to leave the army. In fact, if anything, we want them to stay. We want the army to play a role as the safeguard of the secular nature of the state, of the stability of the state, and to help ease the transition and to protect minority rights and to help the ease in transition from where we are right now to a post-Assad period. We realize that the army has a really important role to play. We want the army in its current leadership. Many of the leaders are Alawite, and many of the high-ranking officers are Alawite, to feel that they are definitely part of the process, and to realize that their stake in the political future of the country will not change as a result of our push for democracy. We want the political process to be open. We want the political process on a day-to-day basis to be free from army intervention. But at the same time, we want the army to be there to guarantee the stability and the fact that this process is not dominated by any extremist element. Not on the side, with Salafis and whatever, this boogeyman that always is raised by the regime, but also not by the likes of the Assad, because these are the other extreme that we have, people who want to treat the country as their own private fiefdom. That situation doesn't work anymore. We want the army to realize that there is a need to transition from this kind of a system where you have a family treating the entire country as their own private fiefdom into a country where there are political processes and there are political parties and there is some measure of accountability to the people. And we want them to play a role in that transition from A to Z. So this is basically where we are right now. We'll keep issuing that message. We will continue to issue that message. And we are hoping that at one point the army leadership will get it. As a result of all of the development on the ground and the pressures of the international community, and this is the last point I would like to make before yielding the floor, we have been asked about an alternative. What is the alternative? Who's going to come? Are they going to be the Muslim Brotherhood? Is it going to be a Salafist takeover? Is this a Sunni revolution? It's always been diverse. This is a revolution by activists. The leaders on the ground are in Syria are really leading the decision-making process, and all communities are represented. As if you look at the Damascus Declaration, for instance, people in crowd at one point, you will get an idea of what we're talking about here, because many of there is a similar structure almost emerging, but it's where people are not joining, however, as representative of their parties, but are as independents. This is now, we're trying to field an alternative not only to the regime, but also to the tired, old, traditional parties. So this is not a Muslim Brotherhood thing. This is not a Communist Party thing. This is not a Ba'ath Party thing. This is a movement of independence, hoping that to lead a transitional process that will lead to the formation of new parties that can run in free elections, and then we'll find out, once these free elections happen, the true sort of nature of the political system. But meanwhile, the transitional figures are all independent. They are Arabs and Kurds, Sunnis and Alawites and Christians and Druze, mostly young people. I think 60% of the population of Syria below the age of 30. Most of the people who died in the protest movement, around 92%, are below the age of 30. So we are talking about a very young population, a very young movement. And now we're talking about a very young coalition that we have just, in fact, announced 2 days ago. The coalition is called the Syrian National Initiative for Change. Most of the leaders inside the country, you can probably guess some of the names, but we are not revealing, because there are also a lot of new figures emerging that have been elected on the local level and emerged in the last few weeks as key figures in their communities. And outside the country, there are people like me, Radwan Ziyadeh, my colleague, and Usama Munajid in London, and a lot of other figures, basically, whose names will be hopefully providing a list in the days to come, will be sort of like spokespeople or out-of-country representative for this movement. We will continue, of course, to organize the diaspora around this movement and hopefully get sort of like popular support committees in order to make the representation more transparent and more inclusive of the diversity of the Syrian movement outside the country. So this is where we are right now. The alternative is being formalized. And we are hoping that with a key role played by the army, the international community also through sanctions, travel bans, asset freeze, and potentially also going to the international criminal court if the repression is going to continue, will be able to pressure the Assad into accepting a transitional scenario and an exit strategy.
Thank you. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, a country and a people that has an exceptionally strong interest in what is going on in Syria is the country and people of Lebanon, for whom what goes on in Syria has had for a very long time a powerful effect. I could say for better or worse, but it's always been for worse, more or less. But such such circumstances generally concentrate the mind, and they generally lead to insight and clarity about what's going on in the neighboring situation. That has been true of many Lebanese, but it's, I think, especially true of our next speaker, Anin Reda, who is a journalist, originally from South Lebanon. And if I may say this as someone who's technologically challenged, the new kind of journalist, the organizer of the most important web publication in Lebanon today, called Now Lebanon. And I forget whether you have an alternative site, Now Syria, or it's all part of the same site. But
it's part of the same site, and it was created just before the first Friday of demonstrations in Syria. The live blog.
And as interestingly enough, it is often the case that you can find out what's going on in Syria from what's going on in Lebanon, and and Hanin will be telling us both what's going on in Syria and what's going on in Lebanon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, unfortunately, it's definitely Lebanon and Syria are linked to a certain extent that we cannot today talk about Lebanon without talking about Syria. And the link is very obvious. It's watching Hezbollah's reactions today will tell you, and also Syria's allies.
Maybe pull that a little bit closer. You have a lovely soft voice, but I want to make sure our audience
Okay, thank you very much. Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. Watching Hezbollah today and how Hezbollah is reacting by not pushing for the formation of the government, by also creating certain incidents that would actually show you that they're marking their territory inside Lebanon. For example, I'll talk about two incidents that happened after the Syrian uprising happened. Hezbollah, speak up. Okay, is this better? Hezbollah 2 weeks ago started a campaign in the city of Nabatiyya in South Lebanon, where they forced some shops in Nabatiyya to stop selling alcohol. This is not a big deal. It's not like they're closing liquor stores in Nabatiyya or anything, but it's kind of inside their community, they're telling their people that we are the authority, marking the territory inside the community. But at the same time, they created a few incidents where news was leaked to a Safir newspaper, which is Hezbollah-affiliated newspaper, March 8 newspaper, that published the first news about Hezbollah Shia in the south building on state-owned property. This has been going on since 2006, after the war, when the reconstruction started. Of course, people started building on state-owned land in the south. But
Naturally.
Naturally?
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't that obvious before, but after 2006 it became very, like, with the money coming from Iran and like Hezbollah taking care of the reconstruction, it became a phenomenon. But why now? Why it was leaked to the news now? I think because they also wanted the ISF to react so that a message can be passed. And the ISF, of course, when this hit the news, reacted, and they went up to the south to stop the illegal construction on state land. Tyre and many other villages and towns turned into a war zone. The ISF, the people shot at the ISF, and the ISF had to react, and they unfortunately shot at some people. They killed an Amal guy, Ali Nasser, and they killed another Palestinian guy. During the funeral also, there was other problems in Uzai, close to the southern suburbs in Beirut. Also, ISF vehicles were burned. Why is this happening now? And why is Hezbollah reacting that way? And of course, they didn't react themselves. Not Hezbollah fighters who are shooting at the ISF. It's always the people. It's the people who attack the UNIFIL. It's the people who attack ISF, the STL investigators in Dahi. The women, the people. It's always the people who are at the front creating problems. And Hezbollah is always leading the people from behind. And this is also, I think, is another sign of marking the territory in the south, that this is our state, these are our rules, you cannot sell alcohol, people are allowed to build on state land, because according to the people who were interviewed by reporters, they said, these are lands that we paid for with our blood. So they have a feeling that they have the right to build on these lands. The state has nothing to do with the state land in the south. This is not the property of the state. This kind of marking territory is also, I think it's a big sign of fear that Hezbollah is experiencing now vis-a-vis what's happening in Syria. Because Hezbollah knows what's happening in Syria now is going to influence its power in Lebanon on many levels. Syria is key to Hezbollah, Syria is key to Hamas, Syria is key to Iran, Syria is key to every organization that is similar in the region. So whatever happens in Syria is going to influence Hezbollah, whether it's logistic, when it comes to arms smuggling, it will definitely influence that, whether politically inside Lebanon, when it comes to majority, minority, March 8, March 14, also, if Syria is weakened and if the regime falls, or even if the regime doesn't fall, Syria's allies in Lebanon are going to be weakened. And Hezbollah alone cannot function the same way without Syria's ally. They cannot topple the government, for example, alone. They cannot influence government and parliamentary decisions alone. So they are feeling this concern, and they definitely want the Syrian regime to stay, obviously. And they organized this big conference where every single politician and Syrian and Iranian ally in Lebanon attended and made statements, where a lot of double standards emerged to the surface by Hezbollah and other Lebanese politicians who supported the Egyptian, the Tunisian, the Bahraini uprising. But definitely when it comes to Syria, this is a different case. For them, this is a conspiracy. They made statements about protecting the regime because the regime protects the resistance. And for many people who are not like hardcore Hezbollah supporters or members, who support Hezbollah, who vote for Hezbollah, but more like they tend to be more liberal, leftist, communist people, these double standards, they do not make sense anymore, because for them, the Syrian uprising is genuine, and it's very obvious that this is genuine. But Hezbollah is telling these people, and it's also telling the Syrian people who are being also genuine about their demands, and they know exactly what they're asking for, that Hezbollah's existence is more important than people's freedoms, demands, reforms, and lives. The killings that the regime is exercising, that so far it's like minimum 500 Syrians were killed in the streets, and much more people were arrested and tortured. And Hezbollah is just telling everyone in Lebanon and in the region, and this is very important because they're going to lose also their popularity in the region if these double standards persist, that our existence is much more important than the lives of these people. And this is definitely not something they would like to convey, but they have to, because they have no choice. Another thing that is now becoming very obvious to people in Lebanon, especially for the people who critical of Hezbollah, but more so the people who are in the middle. It's like we're talking about like the Shia community and other communities. There are a lot of people who are Hezbollah supporters, but also they tend to be critical of Hezbollah. And now they are realizing also, and this is, I think, the main thing for the people in Lebanon and in the region in general, that all the violent, aggressive methods that Hezbollah has been using to defeat occupation, to be on when they're on the opposition, all these aggressive military violent methods haven't been that as efficient as the peaceful demonstrations and methods that are actually being more effective in toppling dictatorships and regimes. In Tunisia and in Egypt especially, peaceful demonstrations were more efficient. Even in Syria, the word peaceful, the demonstrators so far, people are dying uttering the word peaceful, peaceful, silmiya, silmiya. This is the main slogan for the Syrians. And it's not just something that they created while demonstrating. I think this is it's a part of their political strategy. I don't know if you agree, but it's peaceful demonstration is definitely what they want to do. And whoever is going to come and take over in Syria, doesn't matter. I don't know who it's going to be, but whoever is going to be coming through peaceful methods, and they will carry peaceful methods throughout. I don't think they will open any front against Israel, Lebanon, or other people in the region. It's going to be peaceful, and this is a strategy. And Hezbollah is really worried about that, because suddenly peaceful methods are being more effective than their own aggressive and violent and military methods. So basically, this is the situation of Hezbollah now. But add to that also the indictment that is coming, hopefully, very soon. Nobody knows when it's going to be published, but this will also add to the fears of Hezbollah, because so far, before the Syrian uprising happened, Hezbollah didn't care about the STL indictment. And even if they were going to be accused, they know for sure that they will no one will be able to arrest any Hezbollah member and send them to The Hague. No one will be able to do anything, because Hezbollah and Syria, they agreed that they will not cooperate with the tribunal, because tribunal is simply an Israeli-American tool to defeat Hezbollah. But now it is different. Some people are saying that I've read some analysis saying that whatever happens in Syria, and even if the regime doesn't fall, even if the regime is weakened, they will do anything to protect themselves. And they will go and cooperate with the people who have the capacity to protect the regime, the international community, the UN, the international organizations. So they might actually cooperate when it comes to the tribunal, and maybe they wouldn't when it comes to their existence as a regime. Their alliance with Hezbollah might be sacrificed for this, whether when it comes to the tribunal or other matters. So Hezbollah also knows that they are like important allies for the Syrians, but when it comes to their existence as a regime, also they might be sacrificed. I also want to add one more thing before I conclude. There's a real concern among the Syrian people and in the region also, from Lebanon to Egypt to Tunisia, everywhere, that there is kind of hypocrisy when it comes to the Western stances towards Syria. People are actually raising a lot of questions about, like, why the U.S. and the West so far haven't taken decisive stances as they did vis-a-vis Mubarak and Ben Ali and others. This is a serious issue, because I think the West, and mainly the U.S., is creating enemies inside within the Syrian opposition figures, because they feel, and they're totally convinced of that. I don't know if you agree, but I've heard many people saying that the U.S. is protecting the regime because Israel wants to maintain this regime, and the U.S. wants to help and protect Israel. And this is definitely not a good thing. People do not, the U.S. is definitely not credible now for the people in the street, for the opposition. And they don't understand, because this is a pro-democracy movement, this is a peaceful movement, and against a dictatorship who is actually an enemy to the U.S. So what's going on? They need to be told immediately. Something has to be done, something has to change immediately. And otherwise, there will be a big problem afterwards when this is over, and the U.S. will look like very like hypocritical in front of not only the Syrians, everyone also in the region. This is major. I think I will conclude now, and I'm definitely sure that you will be asking a lot of questions about that. So I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Hanine. And that is rather a good segue, I think, to the remarks of our next speaker. I would just observe that our principal, barring some further explanation, seems to be that we side with our enemies and are hostile to friends or potential friends. This is very mysterious at the moment, but I think our next speaker may be able to explain this. Our next speaker is
No pressure, no pressure.
is Lee Smith. Lee is a fellow here at the Hudson Institute, but is also an editor with the Weekly Standard. Has written for many, many publications, still does, but publishes practically weekly in the Weekly Standard, and is the author of a very fine book published last year called The Strong Horse, Power, Politics, and the Clash of Arab Civilization. Lee?
Thanks, Alel, and thanks, Amara, and thanks, Ameed. I don't know if I can explain it in its entirety, but I can certainly venture a guess as I've been writing about the last few weeks, and certainly I think it's more, though certainly on the surface this is what it looks like, that we have been siding with our enemies and that we have been helping or rather damaging our friends around the region, both within different regimes and within different opposition movements. And I think it's certainly worth asking why it seems to be that preserving the Assad regime is a vital U.S. interest, why protecting this regime is a vital U.S. interest. And if you look at a series of statements made by the administration, you see that they have been essentially protecting the Assad regime. One of the first statements that came out of the White House was the president, when this was his first statement, I believe, when he in his first sentence, he warned the regime against bloodshed. Then in his next sentence, he admonished the opposition to also refrain from violence, which is astonishing. It's outrageous. I mean, not least because the one opposition movement that the United States has thrown its weight behind in the last 4 months happens to be the one group that went to weapons almost immediately, namely the Libyan rebels, and the fact that the Syrian opposition was entirely unarmed and is entirely peaceful and has remained so. The idea that this administration was warning them to avoid bloodshed is just remarkable. There were a number of other statements that came out of the administration, some of them with attribution, some of them not. If you remember what the Secretary of State said, that she was quoting lawmakers from both sides of the aisle who described the westernized President Assad as reform-minded, making reforms. When she was called on this, she rolled it back a little, saying, well, I didn't say that. I had quoted other people who were saying that. It's preposterous. It appears that this is still what this administration expects, is what it keeps talking about, for Assad to keep to the reforms that he's promised. As he's rolled out tanks, Syrian cities, this administration is still talking about Assad reforming. The notion that this president, who is incapable of spiritual remedy, is somehow going to reform his political system now is preposterous. So why is the White House protecting this regime? Well, the reason is because, actually this goes back, to be fair to the Obama administration, this romance with Damascus goes back to, I think it's lasted for the entirety of the Assad regime, meaning not just Bashar, but his father Hafez as well. If you look if you look at different the statements of different officials and envoys and diplomats who visited Damascus, who've spoken with Assad with this regime since the 70s, you see that they come back with these different statements about Assad as a great man, not a great man, but a man who keeps to his word. You can do business with Hafez al-Assad. What these different promises that the former Syrian president supposedly kept to make U.S. policymaking in the region easier is unclear. They came back and they talked about what a tough bargainer he is, what a tough negotiator was. I mean, there are even U.S. diplomats who boasted that he wouldn't let them go to the bathroom for hours. I mean, it's astonishing what these people believed about this same regime. We saw a brief respite from this with the Bush administration. This was only after, people have to remember, this was only after the Syrians were believed responsible for the assassination of Hariri. It was only at that point that the Bush White House believed that this regime was incapable of remedy. They withdrew the ambassador, and they tried to isolate Damascus without much success, as I think even people in that administration will acknowledge. Nonetheless, the solution was not to go 180 and reach out and try to engage that regime. The reason that they have tried to engage the regime is for two main reasons. The first reason is because the peace process is central to the Obama administration's Middle East strategy. In fact, that is the Obama administration's Middle East strategy. The point is not just to where most people where most administrations, policymakers understand the peace process as a way to get all the other Arab states on board and a way to bring on all the other Arab states. The Obama administration rather understands this as a way to go over the heads of Arab rulers and to win more the affection of Arab and Muslim people. That this was the purpose of the Cairo speech. The purpose of the Cairo speech was to to go around the way U.S. policymakers typically work, which is to do business with Arab states. But of course, this is how diplomacy works. States do business with other states. What the Obama Cairo speech was about was going over the heads of Arab regimes, for better or worse, and for making the case that the United States would win back or win the affection of the Arab and Muslim polities, not their regimes, but societies. And the way to do this was to, if not necessarily to win a just and comprehensive peace between Arabs and Israelis, was at least to show the good faith of the White House. That is why the peace process is central to the administration, because it is about reaching out to Arab and Muslim masses. The subsidiary point to that was, if the administration could manage to make room on the peace process regarding the Syrian track, what that would do is it would put some distance between Syria and Iran. The administration was not entirely insensitive to the fact that Iran was Washington's key strategic concern. But to talk about, but to deal with Iran, that was the instrument that this administration believed was most useful. The peace process. The peace process, by loosening the Syrians somewhat from the Iranian access, by showing the Syrians how much there was to gain from partnering with the United States and from jumping sides, as Egypt had done with the Camp David Accords, had jumped from the Soviet side to the U.S. side. This is what the U.S. meant to do with the Syrians. Now, what we've seen over the last month and a half, since the middle of March, what we've known all along is that this regime has very significant strategic interests of its own regarding the peace process and regarding its alliance with the Iranians. We saw this during the entirety of the Bush administration. People within the Beltway, Europeans, Arab officials were warning the Bush administration, you need to bring in the Syrians. Why are you isolating the Syrians? Engaging the Syrians is a bad move. Someone needs to show the Syrians exactly what they can have. They need to be persuaded that it is their best interest to jump sides And the fact that the Bush administration is not doing that is a major flaw. Well, that is what the Obama administration came to office to do, to show the Syrians it was in their interest to jump sides. Now, what we've seen over the last month and a half, again, is that this regime will not reform. Regimes whose snipers are picking off its own children are not apt to make peace with their own populations, never mind the state of Israel. So it's preposterous that this administration is still looking at this regime as capable of reform. But the reason they are is because there is no other Middle East strategy. There is nothing else that they have going on. There's nothing moving on the Palestinian track aside from a Hamas-Fatah unity deal, which is also bad for the administration, very bad for the peace process. When that happened, you could see the Syria track will become even more important. I think it's going to be very difficult for this administration to find a way to cut the Syrians loose. I don't think they're really protecting the Syrians because there's still an infatuation with Assad. I imagine there's a lot of conflict in the administration. What are we going to do with this guy shooting his own people in the street? We can't really do business with him anymore. So this is a serious conflict for the administration. I want to say that the same thing happened in 2009, June 2009, after the Iranian elections, excuse me, when the Green Movement took to the streets and the administration was very slow to react. As someone explained in an article in this week's New Yorker, as a former administration official explained to the reporter Ryan Lizza in this week's New Yorker, the reason that the administration was so slow to react was because they still wanted to engage the Iranians. That's exactly what is going on today with the administration's relationship with Damascus. It is still looking for a way to engage the Iranians. It's about the administration's Middle East strategy. That's all they have right now. So at that I'll conclude and open it up to questions.
Thanks very much. I'm going to make a couple of observations and pose a couple of questions, and then I think our panelists can feel free to poke each other a little bit if they like. And maybe I'll start with this last point, which was raised by Haneen, how to understand American policy, and it is a great mystery. But I would hope that that people in Lebanon, in Syria, and elsewhere might be persuaded that that it is a mystery, that it requires an understanding which we don't exactly have, and that there are two aspects to this. One, as Lee says, there has been this extraordinarily long indulgence over many administrations in the notion that Syria was A, very important, and B, a good and useful and productive relationship with them and for the region as a whole was just around the corner. And this predates any, apropos of the Israel question, this predates any serious expression on the side of the Israelis for the hope of a deal with Syria. It goes back to the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. The number of U.S. Secretaries of State who have stood on the tarmac at Damascus airport in between visits to one or another of the Assads is extraordinary. Probably set some kind of U.S. diplomatic record, such that it looks as if somehow or other the Syrian regime managed to bewitch a whole generation or two generations of American policymakers and analysts. And I use the term bewitchment advisedly. It just looks like that. So it requires, for some serious student of history, an explanation. But it should be, that should, I think, be stressed so that people understand this is not a new thing, and somehow shows perhaps either our particular credulity or some very great skill on the part of the Syrians. I would say also, but that it's been heightened under this administration for the reason that Lee says, plus. That is, in the Cairo speech is really a remarkable speech because it was not about the Middle East at all, except incidentally. It was really about our relations with the Muslim world as a whole, all 1.3 billion Muslims. And somehow, and that's a clear ambition of that speech is somehow to restore a relationship or create a relationship between us and all the world's Muslims, and somehow or other everything else hangs on that or derives from that. I think that's probably the clearest explanation for the preoccupation with the Israeli-Palestinian thing, which is that the notion that somehow all the world's Muslims really care about that terribly much, and if you could solve that, then somehow America's relations with the world's Muslims would improve. That may seem far too global for people living in downtown Beirut, but I think there's a very powerful side to that. The other thing I wanted to say, and this leads to the questions, the centrality of Syria is a kind of dogma in almost every account of events in the Middle East, and it's repeated endlessly in the newspaper accounts of today's events. The centrality of Syria, the importance of stability of Syria, and so forth. And if you open the pages of the paper today, you'll see those phrases used continually. So the question I pose is really, how central is Syria? And if it is so central to the region, what is the region going to do with regard to Syria? There are two large players in the region besides outside parties, namely the Turks and the Iranians. And I would be and I'm sure our audience would be interested in your reflections on how the present dynamic may draw them in, what their calculations are, so forth. But let me start from one particular situation now, and that is the situation in Dara. Over the past that's where it began, and that's where the regime seems to think it could end it. Now Dara it's not a village, but it's only 75,000 people. It's not that far from Damascus, but it's not. It's on the border. It's not in the heartland of Syria. Why has this taken on so much importance, and why have they decided to bring in tanks to deal with? I mean, it's horrible enough that when they're shooting people with rifles and machine guns, but tanks? Why? How is? What's their thinking, and what is the thinking of tanks?
Well, I think I'll start by answering that question about Dara. It is really heartbreaking to watch the situation unfold in Dara, and to watch also the international community failing to come up even with a clear condemnation of the developments there. And 2 years ago, in a sort of a small TV program, I was interviewed about Syria and the change and whatever, and whether it's going to happen or not. And I said that one day we will be able to, take the streets and fight peacefully for our freedom, and that the main goal will be for us on the outside, and our role will be to shed light on the development so that we prevent the occurrence of another Hamas. And we've made that promise. The Hama is a city in 1982 that was destroyed by Assad forces because they tried to crush a rebellion in the city. There were about 200 armed people. That is true. But they ended up actually destroying half of the city and killing 30,000 people in order to get these 200 which we agree are terrorists. No one denied it at the time. No one disputed that at the time. But killing 30,000 people to stop 200 terrorists is really, not what the situation we want. So the kind of rhetoric that the regime is now using from the very beginning, and the reason why Bashar al-Assad, when he spoke about infiltrators and armed gangs, it immediately to us, rang all different sort of alarm bells, is because this is exactly what we were afraid of, is that by throwing this accusation at us, is that we will end up having a situation like this where the government will move in full force against the pockets of resistance here or there, and they will justify it like they did in Hamas. So we were very clear from the very beginning to try to document the type of movement we have on the street, to show that they are unarmed protesters, and to show that they come from different sorts of backgrounds, and to be very clear and about getting the information out as quickly as possible, so the international community realize what they're dealing with here, and realize the true nature of the movement, and not fall into the trap of regime rhetoric. Of course, we cannot make the willingly blind see. If there are some people in this world who are willingly blind, who want to see Assad as a reformer for whatever reason, ideological reason they have, I don't think we can make them see. This is a situation that's behind us.
Actually, since they may not be willingly blind, they may just need an ophthalmologist.
Exactly, and they're going to Bashar Assad for that. Well, unfortunately, the ophthalmologist himself seems to need an ophthalmologist at this stage. It's really, we're talking about a serious situation right now in Daraa, humanitarian situation. The city has been under siege for several weeks now, and over the last week, in fact, the siege was complete. No electricity, no water, no food in and out, no medical supplies, and tanks invading, artillery shells, gunfire, bodies strewn in the street, according to eyewitness reports. We can no longer get videos out of the city, basically, because for one simple reason, when there is no electricity, you cannot even charge your camera anymore, or your cell phones, which were used to take many of these images that you're seeing. So there are, logistic problems along these lines, but we still get some images every now and then, and we still can communicate sometimes with some witnesses on the ground up until recently, and we get really horrifying tales. It's very difficult to be able to corroborate everything, but on the basis of what has happened before, we can say that the situation definitely is scary, and the fact that we might be witnessing a massacre, basically, while we continue debating the finer points of what American sort of ideological interests are is somewhat
So you think in a way that the proper reference point here is nearly 30 years ago in Hama, that they are preparing another Hama as a demonstration lesson.
I think the idea is that they chose Daraa because it's can be isolated easily, and they want to send a message to the rest of the Syrian population that we are not going to put off with protest. Now, it's interesting to see that the few videos we got to see that the protesters were throwing stones and rocks at the tank, so they are not exactly being cowed. And it's also interesting to realize that even as this intervention taking place in Daraa, and as hundreds of arrests are also happening in many suburbs of Damascus, in Homs, in Banyas, in Jable, in Latakia, that the protest movement keeps fielding numbers in the streets. Yeah, there were still people protesting in other suburbs where the security presence was lightened because of overcommitment elsewhere, and people were still willing to defy. In Banyas, people still got out in numbers, and when they realized they were besieged by the army, they said, well, if the army wants to come, we'll meet them with our bare chest. So it's we are having a situation where people have to realize the majority of the population are really extremely young. The protest movement is based on youth participation, and young people, when they break the barrier of fear, they really can be irrational about it. Let's put it this way: they are not going to be afraid of martyrdom. Basically, martyrdom is a very emotional part of our culture, and once it gets endorsed, whether it's the liberal, secular, where the communists, the Islamists, everybody has a certain attachment, emotional thing for martyrdom. To us, fine, we die for freedom. Why not? We're tired of being lied to. And when every time a Syrian official comes out and says, look, there are infiltrators and armed gangs, immediately that the problem and the crisis of trust deepens, our position hardens, our demands escalate, we have more people added to the blacklist. We don't want that situation anymore. We cannot stand it. So whether people are betting on Bashar al-Assad's ability to contain it, I'm telling you, it's not going to be contained. And if it's quieted down for a week or a few days, we will inflame it again from inside the country, from outside the country. This is going to end the way we want it to end, with the regime toppled, with Bashar al-Assad and his ilk, either in Sadaya prison, where they killed so many people in 2008, or if they still have a small chance of ending up in London in some flat, basically a Tender Royal wedding, be that as it may. But there is no other solution. There is no other solution. Bashar al-Assad, his ilk, has to go. That's it.
Thank you. This is great. I would like to go back to the first question you had about, like, if why is Syria central? There's something that I think that everyone should take into consideration and actually consider many times. You were talking about the peace process and why the U.S. actually wants Syria or might be expecting Syria to be part of the peace process. I don't think Syria would be interested in peace for a very obvious reason for me. I don't know about if you agree with me, but I think conflict is very important in protecting the regime and maintaining the regimes. They survive. The Syrian regime survives on conflict. Because of conflict, there is the emergency law that allows the regime to arrest people, to create a state of fear where everyone is not allowed to act freely, without the freedom of speech, without political freedom, without anything, because of the state emergency, which is based on conflict. And that's why they support Hezbollah. That's why they support Hamas. That's why they support the Iranians, because they need conflict. So I really don't think that the Syrian regime is interested in peace. This is something that everyone should reconsider while thinking about, like, whether Syria is key or not.
Yeah.
It is key to Iran, yes. It is key to Hezbollah and Hamas. And it's definitely very important as an ally, but it's not... They really want to play a major role in the region, and they have during Hafez al-Assad's time, but they're not playing a major role now. Hezbollah and Iran are playing the major role in the region. They're just there to assist them and keep some bargaining chips here and there to negotiate. But that's it. And now I don't think they can actually use these chips anymore. So this is my point of view.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably true. It's actually forgotten that there was a deal proposed between Israel and Syria, from which the Assads withdrew over, I believe, some handful of centimeters. So I think that tends to reinforce your point that they never wanted to settle because of the advantages of having the conflict continue.
Yeah, I was just going to say I entirely agree with you, Haneen, and I think that this is one of the problems that I think neither this administration or many administrations before it who have tried to drag Syria into the peace process have understood this, that sitting with the Syrians at the table, it only strengthens their hand. It's one of the things they want. They want the benefit of prestige given it by the United States when the United States brings them into the peace process. I just want to, you and I have been talking about this a lot, and Ahmad and Halil, maybe or maybe if you want to open it up to the audience as well, maybe someone will know, but my question has been, over the last few weeks, why do we continue to talk about what happens after Assad? I mean, there are people in this city who should contemplate this, but after all, the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, has painted itself as an adversary of the United States. It helped facilitate the flow of Islamist fighters into Iraq, killing thousands of U.S. troops in Iraq.
Right.
It killed it killed Iraqi allies. It killed our allies in Lebanon, in Israel, and the Palestinian territories. This is clearly an enemy of the United States. Why do we care what happens after? It is not clear to me when people say, and of course I believe it's true, especially in the Middle East, that things can always be worse. No one to me has made a good case what can be worse than this particular regime. with at least 2, maybe more secret nuclear facilities, with chemical warheads pointed at Tel Aviv, with its support for Hezbollah, Hamas, and other terrorist outfits around the region, with its alliance with Iran, what can possibly look worse? I mean, someone needs to make that case. A Salafi regime that really gets to the nuclear bomb? A Salafi regime that actually fires those warheads on Israel? Well, the fact is, the only thing that has restrained Damascus has been outside pressure on Damascus. They don't limit themselves. It's the limits imposed on them that manage to rein them in. So I don't know. I mean, do you have any idea, like
Well,
what the?
this is exactly one of the problems. I mean, for a long time we've been, asked about the alternative, and for a long time a lot of people were painting scenarios that the situation is going to be worse and worse. And the problem is, when people talk to me and they say, well, the alternative is the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, I'm telling them, well, I've been working in Syria and as an activist for many years, and obviously I'm among my colleagues, I am going to be not necessarily elected, but part of an alternative. You know, we are the new voices out there. Do I look like a Salafist to you? I mean, does my friend Bassam Bitar over there look like a Salafist?
He does, not you.
Considering, of course, his background. I mean, it's
If I may,
intimidating to have at this stage to begin is then to identify what I'm a Christian Syrian. Come from this background or that background, just so we can evade this accusation of being Salafist or being members of the Brotherhood or whatever. It's really ridiculous to have to defend ourselves at this stage. But what's more ridiculous is that when people ask me, well, it's mosque-centered protests, and I tell them, well, I mean, one thing about Syrian society is that the civil society have been decimated under their side, that the only place where we can meet freely still is a mosque, relatively speaking freely, because even the imams oftentimes are appointed by the state, all imams are appointed by the state and have to sort of follow the line of the state, and those who don't are immediately removed, or they have to go through the same kind of security hell that every dissident have to go through. So the fact that we have to sort of focus on the mosque at this stage is normal, natural. We have no other choice. But the other thing is, it seems to me that there is this kind of craziness going around that if you're religious in any way, shape, or form, you're an extremist, especially if you're a Muslim. And do we have to renege the faith? Do all Muslims have to renege their faith in order to be moderate? So yes, the majority of the Syrian people are religious. Whether they're Christian, by the way, or Muslim, whether they are Sunnis or Shia or Alawite, the majority adhere to the faith in which they were born. A liberal like me would wish the situation had been otherwise. People will question tradition and whatever. But this is the situation for liberals probably everywhere. Religiosity is still an important part in the fabric of Arab societies, of Middle Eastern societies, if not global societies. So let us not confuse religiosity for being extremist, and this is something that people really have to understand. If you're looking for alternatives to the Assad, the alternatives have been staring you in the face for years and years and years. All of the dissidents and all of the opposition members who came out and spoke basically were moderates, liberal. Even the Islamists basically adopted very rational tone that pro-peace, pro-West, for all the 10 years under Bashar rule. Many people will say this is tactical and this is going to change once they come to power. But for crying out loud, for 10 years we've been consistent in our message. And our own vested interest lies in developing our countries, in building universities, hospitals, roads, not in instigating a case of war with Israel and that can lay havoc to our infrastructure. We are not capable of waging that kind of a war at the risk of the future of our country and at the risk basically of bequeathing more and more destruction to the next generations. We are not interested in that. We want the Golan back, yes. Every Syrian wants it. But there are diplomatic means for getting it back, and serious diplomacy can work. Almost it worked under Hafiz al-Assad, and it was not serious diplomacy, as you pointed out. At the last minute, they balked. We won't balk at the last minute. We want commitment to the diplomatic. We are committed to the diplomatic process, and we want to get the Golan back. We know we can get it. We know we have a lot of support in the international community if we are committed to the diplomatic process to get the Golan back. We know a lot of Israelis want to give it back if we can sign the peace agreement. So we're not worried about that. What we're worried about is developing our own countries, and what we're worried about is getting rid of the only obstacle in our path towards the better future, which is this small clique of people that uses sectarianism, that uses conflict in the region to prep themselves and to keep themselves in power. The Assad's days are numbered. People who are afraid of the alternative should really snap out of it. I don't know how delusional they will continue to be after all these years and after all these attempts at making them see the light. And now that we have people being killed with cold blood in the streets, and as you pointed out, snipers killing children, for crying out loud, openly, and we've recorded that on videos very clearly for everybody to see. No one disputing the veracity of the videos on part of this administration or any human rights organization or any European government. Everybody says, yes, this is true. We know it's happening. We're sorry. Well, snap out of it. We want you to go beyond sorry. We want you to embrace the alternative. We want you to push for change.
What are they saying to you? I mean, you're speaking with some of the people in the administration. What do they say to you?
Am I? To be honest with you, I haven't had a single meeting with an administration official since Obama came to office.
Oh, okay.
Are
there Syrian opposition people?
There were some people who did, and basically the language so far has been consistent with what you've seen with the statement coming out of the White House. We are aware of the situation. We condemn violence, and we hope Assad will reform. Basically, it's been annoying, and it's been.
We now have another technical definition for American action created largely through the Libyan crisis, which is a humanitarian crisis. So I'm just wondering whether that killing children is ordinarily
remember what Secretary Clinton said? I mean, Secretary Clinton explained the Libyan intervention on the Libyans are using airplanes against their own people, which, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but if I'm the Syrian regime, I interpret that as pretty much a green light to just avoid using fixed-wing aircraft.
Oh.
And if you surround towns with tanks, then that's fine.
By the way,
that's a free shot.
In Daraa, the way the troops were transported was by helicopters. So they used choppers already in the conflict in Daraa. And today, early this morning, we had even reports that there was aerial bombardment, but I couldn't confirm that. So there are wild rumors running about the place. So we have to be very careful. But the reality is, I wouldn't put it past them anymore. I mean, it's they got into a situation where the international community, especially after the failure to issue a clear indictment through the United Nations Security Council, that they feel encouraged, they feel empowered, and to do anything they want. Unless the international community really adopts a language of sanctions and implements serious, tough, targeted sanctions against members of the Bashar and Maher, to be specific, and unless there are travel bans and clear warnings that this will go to ICC if you persist in it.
Well, we hear right that there will be Hisham Melhem, I think, is reporting this, right? That there'll be sanctions, but it will focus on Maher and not Bashar. Bashar will not be included.
Well, I definitely would not agree with that, and to be honest with you, I also do not see the US working on by itself having much impact at this stage. I mean, they should lead the way, but the EU is important. The Europeans is where the money is, and as far as the Assad is concerned, this is where their bank accounts are, whether it's in Switzerland or Luxembourg or Liechtenstein or Deutsche Bank or whatever. This is where their funds are. We can tell you. We've been investigating that for a while. An asset freeze by Europeans and sanctions by Europeans will definitely have an impact, a major impact on the situation.
You know exactly where you guys know where the money is?
We have a lot of information. Everything, no, but we have now clear idea.
Have you published that?
No. Would
you?
We are going to push it. I'm game.
Journalists can work this out later.
No, I just think it's show people what's going on. Say here's where the money is.
I'm okay with that with the idea. Let's indeed. We'll talk about that later.
Let me return a little bit to the subject of Lebanon, but first observe that on this issue of what might succeed, as a person known to worry about the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood in various places, I must confess, one place I don't is in Syria, and that's for a rather cruel reason. What happened after Hama was that the regime suppressed the Ikhwan far more effectively than anyone else has ever done, certainly more effectively than the Egyptians. And therefore, if one doesn't have to worry about that, one has that to some degree Hafiz al-Assad to thank. But the point is that's not, I think, a current issue. The issue on Lebanon that I wanted to ask a question. If I understood you in a different context, you had suggested that Lebanon is often, as you said earlier, a bellwether for Syria, and that the signs were promising for Syria. It is because Hezbollah is frightened, and certain well-known calculators of interest are also withdrawing their bets from Syria. You mentioned that I think yesterday Walid Jumblat had declined to show up to the conference that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And since he's known to be usually on
radar.
the head of things, so that's the promising side. As far as Lebanon itself is concerned, should there be a change in the regime in Syria, Assad falls, let's say there's some kind of regime which at least is broadly representative of the divisions within the country, which Amara described as this majority Sunni, then important Jewish community, important Alawite community, important Christian community, important Kurdish community. What does that do? What blessings or curses might that bring to Lebanon, in your opinion?
Let me start with the bad points.
What's true?
Then I'll give you the good news. In my opinion, and many people in Lebanon also are concerned about the reaction if this regime reaches like a threshold or is about to fall, when it becomes a matter of existence for the regime and for Hezbollah. There are many concerns that something might happen in Lebanon in order either to divert attention or link Lebanon to Syria in many ways, and also some people also are afraid that the front between Hezbollah and Israel also might be opened. I think it's too early for this to happen, because so far it's not necessary, and definitely Hezbollah doesn't want to initiate a war with Israel now, for the simple reason that they can maintain their support base as long as they are protecting their community. But initiating a war is not protecting the community, and the community is definitely, whether Shia or non-Shia who support Hezbollah, they do not want another war. They might accept another war, sadly, if it's just like, if Israel starts it. But if Hezbollah initiates it, this is definitely the end of of its support base. Only maybe 20% of the hardcore Hezbollah members and supporters will stay with him, and that's it. So they are very aware of that, and if this was not true, they would have started a war before. But this is very true, and many people do not want another war. Inside Lebanon, I don't think any conflict might actually divert the attention, and a clash between Hezbollah or other fractions you need an equal rival for a conflict in Lebanon, and there's no equal rival for Hezbollah now, an armed militia or anything. So this is kind of also far-fetched. And when it comes to a point, and they have to weigh, for example, their existence, the mere Hezbollah's existence itself, with vis-a-vis their community support, they might actually do something dangerous, but they really have to be like pushed to the extreme to be able to do that. And so far, I don't think this is the situation now. And also, something also happened in Gaza with Hamas. very similar scenario when they launched rockets and bombed the bus. This was, I think, an attempt also by the Syrian regime to divert attention of what's happening in Syria. Didn't work. Attention was still on Syria. Israel didn't react probably the way they were expecting it to react. It didn't work. So this is another reason why I think it's not going to happen in Lebanon now, at least. The good we'll go now to the good news. Definitely, I really believe that a change within the Syrian regime, whether a weakened regime or the fall of the regime, of course will weaken Hezbollah. Of course, it will weaken its allies in Lebanon, and this will definitely be a boost for March 14. March 14 is so far, I think they have done. They haven't interfered in any way. Didn't make any strong statement, although they're getting a lot of accusations by the Syrian regime and Hezbollah of funding and sending arms to the protesters. They're not making any. I think it's a good idea not to do anything right now, because this is dangerous. Lebanon, we are in Lebanon. Like you cannot be make strong statements unless you're a journalist. And it's okay, but as a politician, it's definitely not a good idea.
I'm not sure it's altogether safe for journalists.
It's not safe. It's not safe, but it's your choice, and if you you can it's fine. And a lot of journalists who are expressing opinions in Lebanon, it's fine. But as a politician, it's very critical. And I think this is a good move by March 14 for not actually making strong statements, because the accusation is already there. So, but definitely they're all aware that any regime change in Syria will definitely be a boost for March 14. The ideal scenario would be a liberal government with liberal intellectual activists. But even if it's not that case, even if it's more Sunni religious, not necessarily Muslim Brotherhood, I really don't believe that the Muslim Brotherhood will be actually the alternative. But no matter what, it's definitely better than this regime for anyone in Lebanon, except for Iran and Hezbollah, definitely.
Yeah, right here. And by the way, please identify yourself.
Sure. Thanks for our panelists. Very interesting. Firas Maksad of the Lebanon Renaissance Foundation. I want to take you back to the debate about the administration and its Syria policy. I would like to know, first I want to go out and say that I agree with a lot of what has been described here about the administration's policy, and you don't need to take my word for it. You simply need to read the front pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post and see the criticism of the administration. But that said, do any of you believe that there was last weekend was sort of a tipping point with Great Friday, the 150 plus protesters that were killed, unarmed civilians, and then on Monday, the announcement of possible designation by the administration, more willingness to see this go to the Human Rights Council in Geneva and to the UN Security Council. Have we reached a tipping point? Is the administration finally getting on board ahead of the game here, or at least just catching up? And two, quick question to Haneen, given the significance of the Lebanese press, the role it traditionally played in the Arab world, alongside Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya today, it was very interesting to see that not only the Lebanese media that is traditionally affiliated with Syria and Hezbollah, but also those more with closer ties to March 14th have been relatively quiet on what's happening in Syria. If you could speak to that.
That's why we have Haneen.
and has that changed since the start of the conference? Are more people now, journalists like yourself, willing to speak out?
Okay.
Should I just go through the first very quickly?
Yeah.
Thanks, Firas, for the question. I would. Have we gone through a tipping point? I think it's hard to say. One of the things that we keep seeing coming out in comments from the administration, they say, well, we really don't know how much leverage we have. We feel our leverage is limited. I think that is less representative of how much leverage the administration really has than how much the administration is already limiting itself. Again, if you read this, check out this article in the New Yorker, this Ryan Lizza piece about leading from behind. If an American government perceives its role, its international role as leading from behind, it is by definition going to perceive itself as limited in the amount of leverage it can exercise. So I would like to I would like to think it's otherwise. I don't know exactly how it plays out, but I'm not sure how much the administration is responding to what's actually happening in Syria from day to day, or how much it's responding to domestic criticism, or how the rest of the international community is moving. Maybe, as I said, I think Hisham is reporting these sanctions that are supposed to come out today or tomorrow. I thought they were supposed to come out before tomorrow, before Friday, but as far as I know, they haven't been announced yet.
Well,
I
it
don't
sounds
know.
like if there was going to be a turning point that would lead to something very powerful, on the basis of what Amr said, the clearest sign of that would be for us publicly to go to the Europeans and say, we need you to. That would be leading from, in a way, behind, but it would be leading, and because the leverage that can be supplied by sanctions seems to be much more powerfully concentrated in the hands of Europeans.
Indeed, I agree with that. I think what I want to see from this administration is clearer criticism of Assad's own handling of the situation. You know, don't keep him above the fray. He is the problem, and he is at the heart of the problem. So I want to see a line on that, a clear description of this regime as being family-based and this being the problem, rather than sort of tiptoe around this. And
I think just moral clarity, so everyone gets the idea, whether it's protesters in Syria or whether it's the regime itself, whether it's the Syrian ambassador to Washington, everyone should get the idea that the United States is no longer going to lend that regime prestige by pretending it's a clique of hardliners who are really working against the interest of this reform-minded president. I think the more clear it can be, and the more the regime gets the picture, this is where the United States is, I think the better.
I think it's really important. This in itself, you're quite right. Once that is formulated in the right terms by the United States, that the problem is with Assad, that the problem is with the way he's handling it, that this is no longer acceptable, that this kind of violence is not acceptable at all, and not be equivocal about this by saying violence in general, but no, this Assad, authorities' use of violence basically against unarmed protesters. We need to have that kind of clarity on the situation. Then, frankly, I don't think Assad will get how much in trouble he is. And at the same time, when you go to the Europeans and you push them into adopting a clear sanctions, you don't really need to get UN to approve everything, because if you're going to have problems with Russia and China at this stage, they're going to block everything. But you can still actually implement sanctions by the European Union and asset freeze that will really hurt the Assad, without having to go to the UN. The UN might be a tough nut to crack at this stage, simply because of what everybody says, the regional alliances and Syria's centrality and whatever, which still plays in the mind of many politicians around the world. It's not only here, but in Russia and China, and even Lebanon could not at this stage take a position on this issue because of the no one is blaming you. It's just we understand the situation. So it's really I think the United Nations Security Council is aware now of the situation. At least it's discussing it. We might get to have a resolution at one point if the Assad persisted in behaving with impunity. But the European Union by itself, in cooperation with the United States, they can really do a lot of damage to the Assad if they wanted to.
I have a question over here.
I think I need to answer what.
Oh yes, I'm sorry.
Questions.
Okay, but bring the microphone over here, and
Okay.
Doug, hold on to your question.
Quickly about Lebanese newspapers and media outlets. A lot of Lebanese media outlets, actually TV channels and newspapers and even radios, are owned and funded by politicians, and these ones actually are being very quiet, like Hariri's newspaper and TV channels, and others that are either affiliated with a party or a politician. There are others, and especially independent websites like ours and regional papers and TVs that are taking a different stance, like Lebanese journalists, for example, who are working for Al Hayat newspaper. It's a regional Saudi newspaper, and they're writing a lot about Syria. We're writing a lot about Syria. We're saying exactly how we think.
Why don't you talk about the Now Syria site, just so people know how much work that you have been doing on this?
Yeah,
it's
like
really
from the
important.
beginning. This is the 6th week, for example. Other than the editorials and the comment pieces and analysis or op-eds, there is like the main thing on the website, like the main picture Twitter is now replaced with a live blog on Syria. It was like news, constant minute-by-minute news on what's happening in Syria in English, coming from news agencies, TVs, Facebook groups in Arabic. We translate, of course, everything, and Twitter and most of the YouTube videos coming from Syria. And writing opinions is one thing, but coverage is something else. So you have news, you have information, and you have analysis. When it comes to news, now Syria is news, but also doing everything else. TVs, politically affiliated TVs and newspapers are doing the coverage and some of the information, and but the main stuff, so that they do not look like they're really in denial. Others are providing more coverage, like MTV, for example, which is affiliated with March 14, is definitely providing more coverage, but not as for example regional TVs such as Al Arabiya, Al Jazeera, Al Hurra, BBC Arabic, and France 24 Arabic. These regional, international Arabic-speaking televisions and channels, and sometimes also newspapers, are doing the real coverage. Al Jazeera is a different, it was interesting to watch Al Jazeera as well, because only 10 days ago Al Jazeera changed its angle on Syria. At the beginning it would look like it's kind of protecting the regime, and the people were also very upset with Al Jazeera. People in Syria were very, very upset with Al Jazeera. And it was all over Facebook. Yani, they were calling for Al Jazeera to do the coverage, because they are aware, like everyone else in the region, is that when Al Jazeera decides to criticize the regime, the uprising will work. The regime will be toppled. It's true. Whether we like Al Jazeera or not, whether we agree with its agenda and principles or not, it is true. It is very popular. It is the most popular media outlet in the region. And when Al Jazeera picks up the uprising, it's a huge help. And it's funny. At the beginning, they for 4 weeks almost, it didn't. 10 days ago, something happened. They changed and they moved to the other side. And I'm sure you realize, yani, it was very interesting to watch Al Jazeera. And it's now Lebanon.com. Of course, it's okay.
Just a quick note on this, very quickly, just by way of revealing how the regime actually works. Al Jazeera is now being accused of smuggling, on Syrian TV, a report on Syrian TV, of smuggling hallucinogens to the, and drugs to Syria. And they had this major report of crackdown showing you bags full of sort of pills, and they have Al Jazeera logo on them. So, so this is how the regime... And then BBC Arabic also recently have been accused by Syrian TV. There was a cop that was apparently a policeman that was attacked by protesters. And he was saying, well, BBC Arabic was there and was urging the protesters on, and they asked me to join the protest, and when I refused, they beat me up. So BBC Arabic has taken apparently an active part in the protest movement, according to the regime. So this is just to show how the kind of coverage we get in from state-run media and the kind of propaganda that's being promulgated.
Doug? I'm Douglas Fife, a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute. When the Libyan upheaval began, there were very clear divisions within Europe on attitude toward intervention, and I'd be interested in whatever light you could shed on the attitudes in Europe right now towards Syria. Do you see divisions? Are any of the officials in Europe inclined to take the advice that Amara Abdul offered about ways to pressure the Syrian government? I mean, what's the situation among the EU countries?
The strange thing is, even as I'm here in the United States, I'm more engaged with the Europeans than I am actually with the administration on this issue. And indeed, there seems to be a lot of interest. We had several sort of phone chats and conversation with officials, basically in different European countries, and they are interested in knowing what do we advise and what do we suggest. So I think there's a couple
lines that are there some countries that are much. I think Doug was pointing to the fact that some countries who are very sympathetic to intervention in Libya and doing something strong, others not, or entirely opposed. Is the do you see
Well, the
can you
French,
make-
the Dutch, and the German really have been very critical of the current development, and very clearly so of the last sort of several weeks. And I think they might spearhead the drive for imposing sanctions on the regime. It remains to be seen. Of course, we it's still a political process. Let's see if they can get consensus on that. But I know that there have been very tough language coming out of the German and French and Dutch officials. I know that there is sanctions are being seriously considered. But I think if the United States simply adds her weight behind that, and I think the process will move much more quickly, and can be and the sanctions could be tough. So I'm hoping that this will be.
Yes.
Thank you. Joe Jabali with the Lebanese Information Center. Going back to the administration policy and positions, and I think in addition to what Lee said about understanding that our interest is in the removal of the Assad regime. There is no interest whatsoever in this regime. The fact is that this administration is also about multilateralism. So it's important for the president and the administration to have multilateral actions. They talk about multilateral sanctions, by the way, not just unilateral or U.S. sanctions. Which brings me to the question about the Arab position. Of course, multilateralism in this region of the world would involve also the Arab regimes. Where do the Arab states stand now? Qatar, for example, of course, we saw Al Jazeera. But where does Qatar stand? What about the role of Turkey and maybe others like Saudi Arabia? Thank you.
I think you want to make an outside observation about all of this?
Sure. It's a very good question because nobody knows actually where where these countries stand now. Qatar, you can sense a change when you look at Al Jazeera. You can feel it that they're actually more proactive in covering the news. Turkey so far has been just advising the regime, bringing them like books and of how to reform and what kind of reforms. Why don't you read our books about like what about like our great ideas on like how to run a country? So that's it so far, and I really don't understand why. Saudi Arabia, I think, is so far has been also quiet. But I also think that Saudi Arabia might take a different stance if they see the U.S. taking a different stance. They do not want to be alone on this. I'm sure, like if you're in Saudi Arabia, you really do not want to lead on this. While Syria is definitely like more nearby than anyone else, and you have the Iraq also like between Syria and Saudi Arabia, and they really don't want to complicate things. But they might follow the lead. They might actually, because of course, a different or more Sunni regime in Syria would benefit Saudi Arabia. I'm sure about that. And the rest of the Gulf states probably are in the same position. And Lebanon is definitely in a very, very vulnerable position, as you know. Like no one can say or do anything, but they have a lot of.
But it sounds as if you were suggesting that, in fact, that if Turkey took a vigorous role, it might actually have a capacity to do something.
I believe so. Yeah.
Just to nuance this further, I think Qatar's position is more like neutrality at this stage, rather. They are not siding with the protesters, even if they are increasing the coverage, but you can still feel in the coverage a sense of aloofness. I mean, when you compare it especially to how they were engaged in the Egyptian sort of situation, and they were part of the revolution, really. Yeah. Here they are trying to be, quote-unquote, objective, at least in the last 10 days.
I was just going to say, I mean, talking about how they're throwing, Al Jazeera, they're throwing them out of Syria now. I mean, the way I interpreted that is that was a threat, that if the regime survives, I mean, they're saying they're throwing Al Jazeera out, and they were hassling reporters. Mm-hmm. My belief is that must have come from the top, right? They told the Amir, or someone up there, they said, you keep it up, and if we survive, you're in big trouble.
The whole situation with Al Jazeera was really related to the way, I think, the situation was handled by the Assad when Yusuf al-Qaradawi came on Al Jazeera and sort of urged the people to join the revolution. And as a result of this, the Assad demanded apology and from the emir and whatever. And I think he was insulting in the way he handled it, even though the Qataris were willing to sort of accommodate a little bit and sort of semi-apologize, in a way. But I think it was very Assad, like usual. He retained this attitude of half men and telling us what to do. So I think the Qataris felt personally insulted by his attitude. And for this reason, we can see this position. But in fact, yesterday there was a statement, I don't really recall, by a Qatari official, if he's the foreign minister, but basically saying we're okay with the regime, but we're neutral. We have no position in a sense on this. Exactly. So in that sense, this is, I think, right now, it's a neutrality. Saudi Arabia, I don't think they really wanted to see change. At this stage, I think they are not necessarily sort of weighing options, but they prefer the status quo. The Saudis are very difficult to get on board of any kind of change. But perhaps if the United States sort of took the lead, as you said, then the Saudis might then realize, oh, okay, it's coming anyway, so we might as well end up being on the right side of it. But for now, and then the rest of the Gulf would fall in line. Turkey's role is important. But yes, Turkey, and I think Turkey is, this is the case for Erdogan and his party to show their regional proactivity, basically. For a long time, they've been trying to be the moderators and engage the Middle East and say, we're going to be this bridge with the countries in the Middle East, and especially with Syria, and now they're being tested. There was a conference that was held in Istanbul a couple of days ago by Turkish sort of civil society parties close to AKP, and there were a lot of opposition, basically more the Islamist side who were present there, but also there were Kurdish opposition and sort of more liberal opposition present. But that doesn't really, and the event was really given a lot of noise. But at the same time, I think for now, Turkey is hedging its bet on Assad, basically somehow emerging again as a reformer. So they seem to be under that same delusion, that the Obama administration is on, that somehow Assad would reform. Now, I think, however, it's not going to be long for them before they realize this is not going to happen. And the question is, what are they going to do then? Are they going to stand by and let sort of blood be spilled and perhaps the country, hopefully not, but if the reports of army mutiny are true, then, this could become a chaotic situation. So we're, so Turkey's position on this will be very important. Do they want chaos on their foot? To me, it seems to me like Erdogan has committed himself verbally so much to be on the side of reform and change and democracy in the region, and so in Syria, that for him to sort of backpedal now is going to be a defeat in Turkish political terms, and might actually impact his own party and his own chances, and later on in upcoming elections. And so he's on the spot right now, as far as the Syrian situation is concerned. Unless he takes a clear line that's commensurate with the statement he's making, he has a lot to do.
Thank you very much. I think we're about out of time, and I wanted to thank you for this really very interesting discussion of Alaska, an extremely dangerous and sad situation, and invite our everyone here to thank our guests for this discussion.